So before we truly dive into step 4, which is creating that template and going over what template options you have, I first want to go over some general information about resumes, clarify what exactly a resume is, what it's used for, some tips and tricks before you're ready to put everything on paper. So a resume is a marketing tool, and that's going to highlight your work experience, education, and skills that are related to the position you're applying to. Remember, keeping it relevant, right? You'll likely end up having multiple resumes, as we said before. So typically, you're going to have a different resume for each job that you apply to, even if it's only just changed just a little bit. Verbiage, what you include, what you leave out, etc. An application, on the other hand, is used by the companies to perform background checks, and it is legally binding. So sometimes your application may have different information on it than the resume, and that kind of throws people off a little bit. But it really is because it's used for two different purposes. So the application may say you need to go back to the last 10 years of your employment history and include everything. And if you don't, that's legally binding, could be grounds for termination. Your resume, however, maybe there's a job that's irrelevant to the job you're applying to. Maybe you didn't even have it very long. And so there's not much of a job gap that you're having to try to minimize or hide or whatever. And you choose just not to put it on your resume at all. That's okay. As long as it's still on the application piece, because that is the part that is legally binding and it's telling you to list every employer for the last 10 years or whatever their line states. And so understanding that the resume is your marketing tool, and so you do get some flexibility with what you choose to include or not include and how you choose to do this, is something that I think is important to understand. You'll have the two different types of formats, a printed copy and electronic copy. Typically, that printed copy is going to go with you when you go to the interview or possibly job fairs. The electronic copy will be attached to an email or an online application. Most of the time, applications these days are done online, and so that's why you'll probably have both of these formats that you'll need to complete an application and get through that interview process. Just some basics when creating a resume. You don't want to get too fancy or too generic. So we talked about being really generic before and how you need to kind of add some additional value, get a little bit more specific. But we also talked about how it's kind of that fine line. You don't want to be overly specific, where now you're so specific they can't picture you in that line of work. So sometimes there is that balance of being strategically vague. So when we talk about, don't get too fancy or be too generic, I just want to give you an example of kind of some verbiage. So maybe you did screw in light bulbs for a living, okay? Instead of using that verbiage, you might say that you maintain lighting implements. So there's also a sense of what we call resume speak. So you don't want to totally spiffy it up to where it's so fancy, but you also don't want to make it sound, just kind of unappealing either. So there is kind of that fine line of resume speak. Pay attention to the tense of your verbs, and any job that you held previously that you're no longer doing, that's always going to be past tense. We do encourage you to use action verbs and keywords. And so the keywords, again, is for when it goes through that applicant tracking system, so that it's going to pick up on the number of keywords you have. The action verbs really catch their attention, and usually those are going to be the very first word of the sentence. That's kind of the way that I recommend doing that. So even when we were doing our little maps before, and I was like, they greeted customers, they resolved customer complaints, they answered customer inquiries. Each of those things, answered, resolved, greeted, those are actions. And having those as the very first word is the way I would recommend starting off your bullet points. We do recommend that you only have one page. They only look at it for about 6 seconds approximately. And so you're wanting to grab their attention as quickly as you can. Definitely no more than 2 pages. And kind of the rule between 1 and 2 pages is that you want to make sure that it's not just one in a blurb, that it is at least 1.5 or 2 pages if it's going to be longer than the 1. And so one way you can do that is by adjusting some of the font size, different things you can kind of play around with that might change the length as well. But keep in mind that formatting the resume and consistency is key in making that resume also visually appealing, and so that somebody wants to read it. So we do encourage you to pick one font style. Some of the ones we recommend might be Calibri, Georgia, Century Gothic. We do not recommend using Times New Roman. It's outdated, but you want to make sure whatever font you use that it's easy to read. We also recommend on the font size that is between 10 and 12. However, the number one read font size is size 11. So something that you can do is you can start with font size 11, except for maybe you make the headers a little bigger, like summary of qualifications, work experience, education. Those might be 12 for the rest of the resumes and 11, and see where you end up. If you end up at 1 page, you're probably in really good shape. If you're a 1 in a blurb, then that's where maybe you want to change some of that down to 10, and then 11, or play around with the font that you actually use, whether that's Calibri, Georgia, Century Gothic. Sometimes that can change the way that something looks, how long it is. And then you want to proofread and spell check carefully. And not only just with your eyes, because you're going to read it exactly the way that you intended to write it. So have a second pair of eyes looking at it. They may be looking for a stalker, but they're not looking for an STALKER, and spell check is not going to pick up on that. So make sure you do have somebody else look at it and verify that there's no potential typos that might not have been picked up on. That is something that employers are really particular about, is attention to detail. So you want to definitely show them that you can at least get that part right. So we talked about a master resume really in our first section when we were talking about going through and thinking about all of your work history. And so this kind of just touches on master resume once more. So you are thinking back to your very first job. And for some of you, that may be way long ago. And for others of you, that may be more recent. But what's nice about doing the master resume is it can also help you with your applications. So when you go through to do your applications each time, you can pull up your master resume. Because in this master resume, you'll not only have, the duties and things that you've done, but I would encourage you to put the location, so their address, etc., and phone number in this, so that way you can just transfer over when you're filling out the application. I know here it says don't worry about that, but yeah, I need to change that. So anyhow, I would encourage you still include all of that information, so that way when you do the applications, you don't have to Google it each time. I know when I was looking for work, I had to Google the phone number 1,000 times. I don't know why I hadn't thought about just having it written down so I could transfer easily. And so once you have this list of the master resume, again, you're not sending it to any employers. It's really just for you as a cheat sheet to pull from when you do create your individual resumes, whether that's industry-based. Okay, this is my teaching resume, my customer service resume, my assembly resume, whatever, my aircraft, my healthcare resume, or if you're trying to get more specific, which generally I would recommend exactly to the job and to the position, you can begin creating those more specific resumes. Based off of your master resume, you can pick and choose and pull from. So you save that, you keep that, you don't ever turn it in. And so with targeting the resume, we talked about before how important those keywords are because they do pull from the applicant tracking system. And if they don't match enough keywords, sometimes your resume is never looked at by the human eye. So that's why that's important. And so looking at that job description can help you pick out those keywords. If you're having trouble determining what those keywords are, one thing that you can do is you can copy the job description. You can plug it into a word cloud program. It will create one of these word clouds you see here, and it'll kind of identify what some of those keywords may be for you. So that way you can ensure that you've got them on your resume. You want to make sure that you're not using jargon or abbreviations unless it's commonly used in the position you're applying for. So this is just another example that this word cloud allows you to generate this type of thing to help you determine what words are used most frequently in their job description, so you can make sure they're in your resume. Another picture of that. Okay. So with the career profile, you may have heard of an objective statement before, and so they no longer use an objective statement. It's kind of outdated, may make them assume that you might be older. So when we go back to the age discrimination piece, what we would encourage is actually to do a career profile. Sometimes it's called summary of qualifications. You may hear it named a few things, but essentially what it is, it's the very first thing they're going to see on your resume. Usually it's about 3 to 5 bullets long, and it is going to be what is catching their attention to keep on reading. Something that really summarizes your experience. Think about why they should hire you. What are your skills and abilities? So most often I will encourage people to use their very first bullet to summarize their years of experience in that industry. So with this example, it says registered nurse with 7 years experience in private practice, hospital, and hospice environments. I think that's a really good summary given the years and giving kind of the areas of expertise that they have in this career, okay? And so whether it's this particular example, just keep in mind that you don't want to go over 10. So you might say over 10 years experience in XYZ, but try not to use any more than 10 as far as the number for the age discrimination piece. And then they can go on, and this is where you can talk about those skills and characteristics or potential accomplishments maybe that are kind of a little bit harder to put in your resume elsewhere. So you could talk about your interpersonal skills. You could talk about your ability to build rapport or your ability to read blueprints or how proficient you are with a certain computer program. This is where in our job description that we analyzed a few sessions ago, it talked about ability to lift over 50 pounds. You could put that here, ability to lift over 50 pounds. So in these bullets, this is where you're going to kind of put some of those additional skills and characteristics or accomplishments here. So they have experienced charge nurse for major hospitals, strong analytical skills, including assessing conditions and implementing appropriate intervention, trainer and educator of both peers and patients. That's just some examples of how you can create this career profile. But the main thing is that you want to really catch their attention because they're going to go there first and you want them to keep reading. So there is what I call the ultimate cheat when writing your resume if verbiage is difficult for you. So I showed you the mind map in the very beginning because sometimes people have jobs that are untraditional, maybe difficult to find within the system, but most jobs are going to be listed here. And you can probably find exactly what you need to write on your resume using this tool, onetonline.org. However, doing the mind map does allow you to also While you're doing it, you're reflecting on your work experience, which again, I think does help prepare you for the interview process. It helps you connect the dots as to what things might be transferable, what areas you may be highly skilled in once you start noticing those trends and similarities. However, if you struggle with that, or maybe you just don't have the time to do that piece of it, because it is, I think, a critical piece to kind of internalize for yourself in the process, you can go to online.org. You'll type in the occupation that you did before for your resume. So customer service, assembler, accountant, whatever it was that you did that you're trying to come up with the verbiage for your duties, you type that in. We're going to use customer service again. Then it gives you a choice as to what kind of customer service, to drill it down a little bit more specifically, a customer service rep, a bill and account collector, sales agent for financial services, etc. But I'm just going to stick with customer service representative for this example. And so with that, then it is going to pull up all kinds of options for you as to what your duties and tasks are. I'm going to exit out of here, and I'm actually going to go to it in the live version to be able to show you a little bit more specifically. So I'm going to type in onlineonline.org. And I'm going to do exactly what those slides said. I'm going to come up here to the occupation quick search and type customer service. I'm going to go ahead and click customer service representative. And onlineonline.org, it's a tool that is really a career exploration tool. So it can be used for many things. I have a video that kind of explores this particular site in greater detail and how you can use it on our YouTube channel as well. Today, I'm just going to focus on the task section, which is what we would use for when you're creating your resume. So if you skip down here to the task section and you hit the plus sign, it's going to come up with all kinds of duties that you probably did as a customer service agent, such as conferring with customers by telephone or in person to provide information about products and services, take and enter orders, cancel accounts, obtain details of complaints, that you check to ensure appropriate changes were made, that you kept records of transactions, etc. And so here, this is giving you a lot of the verbiage and the keywords that are probably going to be important. And so you don't want to write this down verbatim, but hopefully this will help generate some ideas for you and how you can write it within your resume and explain some of the duties that you might have performed. You'll notice that each of these words, they start with an action verb: confer, check, keep, resolve. Just keep in mind that if it is a job you previously held, you're going to make these past tense. So resolved, kept, checked, etc. And when you're reading these, maybe something is slightly different. For example, when I'm looking at the warehouse one, it'll often say loaded and unloaded things onto trucks and ships, and it goes on. Obviously, being here in Wichita, Kansas, you probably didn't load anything onto a ship. So you're not going to include that, of course. If there was something that was slightly different, you're gonna make the statement true to you and what your situation was. But this can definitely help you with writing your resume if you're struggling with some of that verbiage. I'm going to go back to our slideshow. Okay, so for references no longer go on the resume as well. You're going to put these on a separate sheet of paper, have it typed, have it ready to go when you go to the interview, have it ready to upload if there is a place on the application online. You want to try to have professional references rather than personal references. You want to make sure you get their permission and that you have their correct contact information. And so with that being said, correct contact information, including email address. A lot of online applications these days will require that you have an email address. Sometimes they don't even call these people. They will just send them an electronic survey, and that's why it's important to have that done. There are some applications that if you don't have the email address, it will not let you complete the application. In terms of getting permission, and this is a real life example with my sister, in fact, she applied at a place that she'd worked at previously, had a supervisor she liked there. She used them as a reference, went to the interview and found out the lady had passed away the year before that. So you just don't want to be in that kind of predicament. So it is, something that we definitely really recommend or require. Like, you really should be following up with these people that you are going to be using as a reference, asking for their permission, giving them a heads up that you're looking for work, and to make sure that you've got the correct information. It's the polite and more reference etiquette, I guess you could say, way to do things. And so make sure you are getting their permission first. Some of the top 6 resume mistakes include the resume being too long or too short. And we all know now that it should be 1 page ideally. If it's disorganized or poor formatting. And so using our templates can help with some of that organization and formatting. Make sure you're not using any unrelated or irrelevant information, personal information in particular, like hobbies, marital status, disabilities, things like that. If you're struggling with your descriptions or poor descriptions of education or experience, again, going to Own It Online is a great way to help get you some better descriptions of your experience. You don't want to send an unfocused or generic resume. As mentioned before, we can send out the same resume to everybody, but it's probably not going to be appealing to everybody if it's not really intended or targeted to them. And then the last but not least thing is being repetitive. We see that sometimes with using the same words over and over, provided, or possibly, you've held the same type of job and your duties really didn't change much, just the employer, and so you list it 10 times on your resume. There's another way to do that with the type of format, which would be a combination resume. And we're going to talk about that once I go over the specific template types options that you have. So that will wrap up kind of the general information, things to consider when you're writing your resume, tips and tricks. We're going to come back to actually talk about the template types and the types that we have to offer, and tricks and how to do a chronological, functional, or combination resume.